Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday's video, I made the passing reference to the witch trials of JK Rowling. I was just had to look for something in my email. I had to dig up the email from the person that recommended this to me and thank her for it. And then I noticed that it showed up in a bunch of Barry Weiss Substacks too that I have not read. So obviously this is getting large. In fact, I've heard from at least a couple more of you about this podcast. And so it is getting a fair amount of play. I wonder if this will sort of be the next rise and fall of Mars Hill. It is getting passed around. And I think it's going to be a big deal. The podcast, I think, is very well done. And so I'll probably give it a little bit of attention. I'm cruising through it pretty quickly, but I want to play a little bit of the end of chapter 2. Oh, I got to set everything up. I feel like Grim Grizz. I started and I'm not ready to go. Here we go. This should work.
When you would see these people, burning your books, literally burning them and trying to get them banned and removed from schools and libraries, how did you understand what was going on inside of them?
Well, I think that this is something I explore in the Potter books. A sense of righteousness is not incompatible with doing terrible things.
Okay. So JK Rowling's, most of you probably have some familiarity with her backstory. She wanted to get out of the UK. She goes to Portugal. She finds a boyfriend, starts living with the guy, gets pregnant with the guy, and he says, okay, well, let's get married, and then has a miscarriage, but still wants to go through with the marriage. She gets pregnant again, has a daughter. The relationship with the guy gets increasingly abusive. She starts writing this book, and she basically has to escape, get away from the guy. And eventually she does, and she flees back to Scotland and writes this book. And the book, hardly anybody wanted to touch this book, but the book, of course, catches fire and goes crazy, and she becomes wealthy, yada, 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 yada. Who is JK Rowling? Well, she was born in 1965, which interested me because there's a whole bunch of us, it seems, that were born in the 60s, especially Peterson was born in 62. I was born in 63. Rowling was born in 65. We're all sort of this era. And so Rowling's will become a fairly ardent feminist. And she'll talk about this in subsequent episodes, about the kind of feminism that she very much signs up with. I'd love to do a Grandos conversation with J.K. Rowling. Because I'm very curious. I'm very curious about, and y'all know what questions I would ask her about her religious upbringing, et cetera, et cetera. It'd probably look something similar to what I did with Mary Harrington. But the next episode and the next few episodes after this really get into her story. It's a fascinating podcast. Helen Lewis has a lot to say in this podcast. Those of you who know Helen Lewis from her fame with the GQ UK interview with Jordan Peterson. ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn has quite a bit to say. So this is a very interesting podcast, and there's a lot more in the subsequent ones about what shall we call it? The religion of Harry Potter. And especially how it sort of gets rolling at the same time as Tumblr and Fortran. And the podcast very much sets up Tumblr and Fortran as sort of really the male and the female side of this male and female principalities that are sort of waging war in the culture. And of course, Rowling's begins by getting attacked from conservative Christians that have complaints about the occult references and witchcraft and all of that overt association. There was a young woman started coming to the church for a while. She was living with her grandmother. She was quite young when she started coming to the church, came with an even younger friend. And her younger friend kind of dropped off, but she kept coming. She didn't have a particularly easy home situation. And her grandmother would let her come to church. And her grandmother wouldn't come to church most Sundays with her, but came one Sunday and came up to me and said, "Oh, Pastor, I'm so glad that my granddaughter goes to your church. I'm so glad this is a non-denominational church. It's like, well, no, actually, it's a denominational church, part of the Christian Reformed Church. She didn't know what that was. But then in that sermon, I had made a reference to Harry Potter, and it wasn't a reference against Harry Potter. And it was very interesting to me that this grandmother, she was an African American, had, then told her granddaughter she could no longer come to church here anymore because I wasn't against Harry Potter like I should have been. And it wasn't we were by no means a cult of Harry Potter. I had probably made some reference to, as in the later books, Potter becomes sort of a Christ-like figure, and that develops I actually haven't read the books. I've watched all the movies. I looked at those books and thought, and my wife had read some of them. And she's like, "Yeah, the writing is, yeah." So I was sort of turned off to reading the books, but I have watched the movies, and so I have a basic understanding of the story to the degree. And maybe I'm losing some Harry Potter street cred with y'all. But then her mother sort of bans this young woman from coming to church. Grandmother eventually relented, and she did come back to church, and she's actually had a fairly long relationship with this church and with me as a pastor. But that was sort of my first personal relationship introduction to the community, the Christian community reaction to Harry Potter. Now part of what's interesting about American evangelicalism is that this girl's grandmother did not go to church regularly. And what I often find is that in America, with so much nominal Protestantism, that there is sort of an evangelical culture that is unchurched, but by virtue of the radio stations that they listen to, or now it would be the YouTube channels, or whatever Christian TV media, Trinity Broadcast Network or whatever, they sort of pick up on all of these issues, even though they're not in any kind of Christian community relationship going to. So J.K. Rowling's books are getting burned by Christians, and this is something that it's very interesting. Rowling talks about how she sort of constructs her, I would say, her theological anthropology.
Well, I think that
when you would see these people, burning your books, literally burning them, and trying to get them banned and removed from schools and libraries, how did you understand what was going on inside of them?
Well, I think that this is something I explore in the Potter books. A sense of righteousness is not incompatible with doing terrible things. Most of the people in movements that we consider hugely abhorrent, many of the people involved in those movements understood themselves to be on the side of righteousness, believed they were doing the right thing, felt themselves justified in what they were doing. I suppose for me, book burners by definition, predictably, to me have placed themselves across a line of rational debate. I'm simply going to destroy the idea that I don't like. I will destroy the idea. I can't destroy it, so I will destroy its representation. I will burn this book. There is no book on this planet that I would burn.
So she sort of shows herself here as a classical liberal. This is sort of a classical liberal position: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, and fairly sophisticated understanding, as Solzhenitsyn says, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so she, I'm actually quite impressed by her as I go through this podcast. She comes out as a very thoughtful, honest person. But where is she sort of on the spectrum? Well, she's sort of a classical liberal born in the early to mid 1960s. That's the culture that has formed her, and it's very interesting as you get into subsequent episodes how the revelation of the internet and these fandoms and Tumblr, and part of what made this interesting to me, because obviously I have not written a an enormously best-selling book and gotten fabulously wealthy and had my life transformed. I haven't written any book. I haven't had my life transformed by my YouTube channel, praise God. That's what I was worried about when I had 2,000 subscribers. It's like, well, maybe I should just stop this. But she's a very thoughtful, decent, sincere human being that is thinking carefully and shows a great deal of care and concern about the world and her family. I'm very impressed by her, generally speaking, in terms of how she comes off in this. And actually, because I've watched some of the movies and have a sense of some of the stories, I really have a sense that she pours herself through this narrative in the books. Now, this gets into the Chris Green, Paul Anleitner conversation, a lot of the conversation that we've been having about narrative. The little clip that I played from Benjamin Boyce's video as well, where narrative is sort of this collective communal construct through which we are formed and we see the world and we try to influence the world. And what comes through here is that these fandoms are really in many ways extended religious communities. They come together for conferences. They dress up like Harry Potter. These are deeply religious movements, and this gets into the whole superheroes Western conversation as well. I was thinking about the relationship between, let's say, the gunslingers and the Magnificent Seven with superheroes. Well, they're unlike Superman. Bullets don't bounce off of them, but they're lightning fast with their hands, and they can do things that other people can't do. And they are idealized representations of people on top of certain hierarchies that other people aspire towards. And that comes through very clearly in the Magnificent Seven, and it comes through very clearly in the Harry Potter books. But J.K. Rowling quite clearly wants to present Harry and the kids as growing and developing, as making mistakes, as learning from their mistakes, and really does, I think, a good job with those characters.
No book, including books that I do think are damaging. Mm-hmm. Burning, to me, is the last resort of people who cannot argue.
One theme that really jumps out right at the start of the books is how people like Harry's aunt and uncle keep saying to him, don't ask questions. And I just wonder, what's the significance of having this whole 7-book journey start with that theme?
Well, there you are, you see. We've just returned immediately to the book burners.
See, and you can see sort of, this is the classical liberal framework that she is pointing out here. I'm not evaluating that. I'm just pointing it out.
They are completely certain that they are doing the right thing, and that justifies cruelty, unmerited punishment, telling him he's things he's not. Mm-hmm. He's bad, he's wrong, and hiding information.
Now this is very much the point I was making in the, what did I call that video? Yeah, the video that I put out today, Heavy Traffic Going Both Ways on the Quest for a Spiritual Home. When people want to do an evaluation, let's say some pollster wants to do an evaluation of the efficacy of particular religious communities and belief systems, the evaluative tools that they are going to use are going to obviously be products of the belief systems and the value systems of the people doing the evaluation. And so what J.K. Rowling's just sort of pointed out is that in some ways what happens in the Harry Potter series is that the uncle and the aunt who raise Harry, he's a little boy under the stairs, et cetera, and they're horrible to him, but they're closed-minded, they're dogmatic, and you can have, so often religious people are portrayed in that light, partly because one of the functions that organized religions do is they sort of ossify and slow down transformation. Religious communities have set values, and part of the point that I made is that when you do a survey and see whether, well, Christians or Jews or Muslims or nuns or spiritual but not religious or atheists are more moral or immoral, or you try to evaluate across these realms, well, what valuative system across the realms are you using to measure the people? Well, that sort of leans into Tom Holland's book Dominion, because all of these systems that we're dealing with now, especially her system of classical liberalism, which is a product of the Enlightenment, which is a product of the Protestant Reformation, which is the product of the Christian Church. All of those values are built into that. And so J.K. Rowling's would very much be a candidate for what Tom Holland talks about when he talks about the assumed implicit value system of the West that is simply ubiquitous, and it's been so popular that people have forgotten it has come from them. And I've been playing around with ChatGPT some more and just trying to find what it can and can't do. I'm actually not sure that all of these quotes come from Dominion, because I tried looking for some of them, and so the accuracy of ChatGPT is not to be simply assumed. But a lot of these quotes are very much in keeping with, let's say, the spirit of Tom Holland's book Dominion. Christian revolution had challenged the very foundations of the ancient world and replaced them with something new and startlingly different. Christianity was from the beginning a faith with the power to overturn worlds. I couldn't find that quote in the book, ironically. The Christian Revolution had done nothing less than create the modern world, and that's very much where we are.
And the don't ask questions and the burning of the letters, there you are, you have it right at the start. Mm-hmm. You are not allowed to look beyond what we say is normal, what we say is the world.
There are plenty of stories, especially children's stories, where the heroes are the heroes and the villains are the villains. Mm-hmm. And the only real question in the stories is whether the heroes can defeat the villains. But that's not the Harry Potter story at all. The heroes are flawed. Mm-hmm. Some people we think of as villains turn out to be the ones who save the day. And, so many characters that we at first glance think are bad or scary are actually just misunderstood. And one of the early themes of the books is that if you want to figure out the truth, you shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Part of what's so delightful about this in a children's book is that, of course, is the experience of a child growing up. Your opinions about some things change. Now, the Rest is History guys did a couple of, they have some, if you're part of the Rest is History Club, you get access to a midweek conversation between Tom and Dominic, and they're talking about the editing of Ronald Dahl's books. And they talked about the fact that Ronald Dahl, James and the Giant Peach, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, that there are many grotesque and shocking images in those books, and it's part of the reason that the books are loved by children is because children have an attraction to such things. When you look at what happens, let's say, with Willy and the Chocolate Factory, you find the devastation of these naughty children as they disobey the rules, from sort of a realistic adult perspective, this might look horrible, but from a child's perspective, children's worlds are full of apocalyptic, catastrophic ideas in their imagination. And part of our safetyism, we tend to want to protect children from these things. And so part of what is good about Harry Potter is that Harry Potter, like Ronald Dahl's books, tend to have some of the same things.
That your prejudices can betray you, and that your first judgment might not be accurate. You really seem to have this deep awareness of this type of human behavior that, the temptation to fall into this very simplistic black and white kind of morality. But there is also a clear presence in the books of the reality that there is such a thing as good and that there is such a thing as evil. And even though it's not always easy to tell, you ultimately have to.
Yeah.
Right? How do you discern when a behavior falls on one side of that line or the other?
That's such a deep question, and it goes to the heart of Potter, and it goes to the heart of much of my worldview.
It's very interesting, because if you understand in the later Harry Potter books what a Horcrux is, and of course any people who are listening to Grim Grizz knows that Grim Grizz mines the Harry Potter universe for a lot of his really clever memes. In some ways, the Harry Potter books are sort of the, J.K. Rowling has embedded her soul in these books. It's not something unusual. I think every author does, but given the volume of this work, it's pretty remarkable. I should also say that I have also watched CB Strike. It's a BBC program. You can find it on HBO Max. It's streaming service in the U.S. about a private detective, an Afghan war vet with who's an amputee, and that's also been good. It obviously hasn't risen to the heights of Harry Potter, but Rowling's can write and create characters and create narrative.
Irredeemably evil character in Potter has dehumanized.
And there is such a thing as evil. And even though it's not always easy to tell, you ultimately have to.
Yeah.
Right? How do you discern when a behavior falls on one side of that line or the other?
I mean, that's such a deep question, and it goes to the heart of Potter, and it goes to the heart of much of my worldview. The irredeemably evil character in Potter has dehumanized himself. So Voldemort has consciously and deliberately made himself less than human. And we see the natural conclusion of what he's done to himself through very powerful magic. What he's left with is something less than human. And he's done that deliberately. He sees humane behavior as weakness. He has reduced himself to something that cannot feel the full range of human emotion. There's a huge appeal, and I tried to show this in the Potter books, to black and white thinking. It's the easiest place to be, and in many ways is the safest place to be. If you take an all or nothing position on anything, you will definitely find comrades. You will easily find a community. I've sworn allegiance to this one simple idea. What I tried to show in the Potter books, and what I feel very strongly myself, we should mistrust ourselves most when we are certain. And we should question ourselves most when we receive a rush of adrenaline by doing or saying something. Many people mistake that rush of adrenaline for the voice of conscience. I've got a rush from saying that, I'm right. Mm-hmm. In my worldview, conscience speaks in a very small and inconvenient voice, and it's normally saying to you, think again, look more deeply, consider this. And I was struck early on, actually, in the Potter phenomenon, by how the two characters that caused the most furious debate, and I'm actually using the word furious quite literally there at times, were Dumbledore and Snape. People wanted Dumbledore to be perfect. He's deeply flawed. To me, he is an exemplar of goodness. He did wrong, he learned, he grew wise, but he has to make the difficult decisions that people in the real world have to make. Very difficult decisions. Meanwhile, you have Snape. Incontrovertibly a bully. He can be mean. He can be sadistic. He's bitter. But he is courageous. He is determined to make good what he did terribly wrong. And without him, disaster would have occurred. And I have had fans really angry at me for not categorizing Snape in particular, just wanting clarity and simplicity. Let's just agree this is a really bad guy. And I'm thinking, well, I can't agree with you because I know him. But also I can't agree with you full stop because people can be deeply flawed. People can make mistakes. People can do bad things. In fact, show me the human being who hasn't. And they can also be capable of greatness. And I mean greatness in a moral sense, not in a fame or an achievement sense.
Now, I think there's a lot to like about that section. I thought about the comments that Brooke Sproul was making about intuition there. First of all, J.K. Rowling's comments there are, I think, sort of classical modern wisdom. that sort of has the embedded culture of classical liberalism there, in that you have this nuanced understanding about good and evil. You have this understanding that Voldemort's evil is the end result of a process that's similar to, say, what C.S. Lewis, the point that he makes in The Great Divorce, something that I've voiced a number of times, where a person who grumbles all the time eventually becomes a grumble. That there is a progressive quality to evil that if consistently and habitually, willfully indulging in it, you continue to lose agency. And we call this reciprocal narrowing. It could be basically let's say a process theology version of damnation. And I really like the point that Rowling makes with respect to Snape and Dumbledore, how both of them have backstories. And in the movies, again, I haven't read the book, but in the movies, you do go into backstories, and you do see young Snape and you do see young Dumbledore, and you wind them. You watch them making their mistakes. Of course, with Dumbledore, a lot of his mistakes. Now, I'm by no means a Potterphile, but if I remember the movies correctly, what was his name? Tom Riddle, Voldemort's name before he really continues to go in and become Voldemort, and Dumbledore goes back, and I remember that one movie where you have the memories, and they're kind of, these little wispy things that he had on the ends of wands, and had to go find these memories and play them, et cetera, et cetera. It was fun. But you see the progression, and that's what that's what makes the books compelling. But of course, it's all sort of nested. It's also interesting what she says about adrenaline, and let's say we can call it self-righteousness. We can call it this habit that we have of, when we're filled with enthusiasm, continuing to imagine that we're right. Part of what struck out with me in the Brooke Sproul conversation when she talked about intuition, I have seen this with many people, particularly with women. I'm not saying it doesn't happen with men. I'm just saying I've seen it particularly with women coming to terms with the question of intuition. Now, this very much gets into the question of organized religion or legacy religion versus other religions. But I often will tell people, there are two mistakes you can make with intuition. One is to never listen to it, and the other is to divinize it. For a lot of women, I've heard many women, especially women who have had difficult lives, maybe past histories of abuse or neglect. That could be from bad parenting. It could be from bad relationships. Many women that I've found have said that, they weren't listening to their intuition, and they needed to listen to their intuition in many of those cases to get out of that relationship or get out of that situation to protect themselves. Their intuition was telling them this is wrong. And so then part of their journey towards greater health was learning to listen more to their intuition. But once you learn to listen more to your intuition, you begin to discover that it's also an easy thing to sort of divinize your intuition. I think by virtue of masculinity and femininity in our culture, men tend to be more culturally conditioned to prioritize what we might look at as modernist rationality versus intuition, and vice versa. Part of the irony of the war of the sexes in even the pre-woke feminist conversations is that a low-resolution version of the conversation always wants to say very inconsistent things. Well, if women ruled the world, there wouldn't be any wars. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, Margaret Thatcher, Queens of Egypt, Boadicea. No, it's not true. It's not historically true. But if a woman says, well, we're more intuitive, we're more in touch with those things, and if it's a positive thing, women will say, well, see, we're more intuitive. But then if a man would say, well, but you're more intuitive, which means you're less rational, well, now you're being misogynistic. truth is, men and women both work from intuition and rationality as we construct it. But these are very much stock characters, sort of in the classical liberal modernist frame. And so, and I thought again, I thought Rowling's had a nice position on that. I think the resolution can be upped a little bit more in that position, which would be to recognize that, yes, there are limitations to black and white thinking, but it's sort of the point I always make with respect to bounded set versus centered set. Again, a lot of these ideas, the excluded middle, bounded set, and centered set, a lot of this stuff comes out of late 20th century missiology theory. Probably also has some connections to some late 20th century anthropology work, I would guess, because a lot of missiology sort of borrowed from anthropology. But let's see if Rowling says any more here. These podcasts always have, it's just like Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. They always have these production values. And we just saw they say something and then ping. They say something else and then ping. And on one hand, I'm sure they have reason to imagine this embellishes and improves the user experience. I tend to find it a little bit manipulative, maybe, and for that reason, really rather religious, because nothing can manipulate like a religion.
So let me talk about the infamous book burning video for a second. I am not just offended by what JK Rowling says. I am fearful because of what she is promoting on her platform.
JK Rowling is literally putting trans lives at further risk. She just is. It's disgusting and it's problematic. I mean, let's face it, Hermione would punch this woman in the face right now.
Harry Potter franchise is literally making this world unsafe for kids today.
And so part of what's really clever about this podcast is we begin by showing these religious fundamentalists that are sort of safe stock characters for what we would imagine to be the intended audience of this podcast, which would be university educated, democratic voting, urban Americans, Canadians, people in the UK that all believe that, we are on the right side of history. And, we can say that because, we're not saying that God is on our side. We're saying we're on the right side of history. So we have, instead of source or universe, history, we all have all of these sort of abstract circumlocutions. So we can't say God because that would be triggering people. And even the production values, because for many people in our culture, hearing a choir like this, that's what you hear in church. But now, in many cases, in mid-20th century Christian nationalism/imperialism, college choirs sort of stepped in and became church choirs for people. Is that it?
More to come next time.
Oh, okay. I waded through all of the. I waded through the choir giving the benediction for the more to come next time. Anyway, it's a great podcast. I'm really enjoying it. Now I'm not enjoying it the way maybe I am. This is everything I agree with. No. I'm not enjoying it in that way. At least I don't think I am. Maybe I am because, So anyway, I think it's a good piece of work, and the next episodes that dive into sort of the culture war as it really takes off in the internet, and J.K. Rowling's sort of finding that and having to figure out how to work through that. It's just fascinating the way this story has unfolded. So I'll keep listening to it. I'll probably get through it today or tomorrow, depending on how much time I got. But anyway, so I don't know if this is helpful to anyone, but leave a message if you find it helpful.